good evening. I'm Enrico Wilford and welcome to Budget in Focus. On this program, we are looking at the various ministries, how they've been allocated monies so that they can run their programs for 2019. With me this evening is the Minister of Business, Dominic Gaskin. Minister Gaskin, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Enrico. Good evening, and good evening to your viewers.
You began the debates this morning in terms of the National Assembly and what your ministry will be doing. You were very, very optimistic, Minister Gaskin, but were you realistic?
Very realistic, very optimistic. I'm always optimistic. There's nothing to be pessimistic about at this time of the year. We're looking forward to 2019. We have been given an allocation based on our own request. It is, as usual, always a little less than you ask for. So we are optimistic, A, that we can spend the money, B, that we can ensure that that money is spent in a way that gives the Guyanese people value for the money, and B, that we will achieve the outcomes that that the programs are designed to. So yes, I am optimistic, yes.
But the business sector, if you ask most businessmen over 40 years, 60 years, they tell you things ain't doing too well, you know. They are often pessimistic. What encouragement could you give to the business community?
Well, I think if we look at some of the economic data presented in this budget, we know that everything is never perfect, but if we look, for instance, at the agricultural sector, it's doing fairly well. Sugar is up, sugar production is up by about 18% over last year's production. Also, they're getting higher yields. The exports of fruits and vegetables are up by about 5% over last year. The production of livestock is up by over 20% over last year. So there are a number of indicators. The construction industry has grown by 12% over last year, and that's always a good indicator of economic well-being because people don't construct if they don't have money. So there are a lot of signs. The retail and wholesale sector has expanded by about 6%. So there are a lot of signs that the economy is picking up. We are projected to achieve 3.4% GDP growth for 2018. That can't be a bad thing. That cannot be a bad thing, you know, especially if you look at the Latin American Caribbean average is, I believe, somewhere around 1.2, 1.3%. And our CARICOM brothers and sisters are not getting that sort of growth. You know, Jamaica, Suriname, Trinidad, none of those countries is going to grow by over 2% this year. Barbados is expected to contract this year. So when we say 3.4% growth, it cannot be a bad, a bad outcome.
So what's in the estimates to foster the business development in the country?
Well, we, as the Ministry of Business, do a lot of work, and as I mentioned in my budget presentation this morning, at the heart of what we do, everything we do, it is designed to allow for the creation of jobs by private enterprise. In other words, we try to encourage private enterprise, especially in value-added areas. So we work in tourism development, we work in industrial estates development. We, a number of our agencies, whether it's investment promotion or export promotion, it's all designed to increase business, increase exports, increase value-added production, and generally so that jobs can be created, so that there are more investments in the economy. And like I said, job creation is the key outcome that we are looking for.
You know, yesterday in the Sunday newspapers, there were three or four ads that struck a nerve, so to speak. One was the fact that your ministry started to announce the small business loans and what have you. Another one was about the fact that there were scholarships from the Ministry of the presidency for the UK. The other one was from the NDMA about laying the cable, the Suez Dyke to Linden. But the last one was public infrastructure, talking about the seawall, noise, nuisance, and the Marriott. And more people paid attention to that. So I want you to pay attention to your small business bureau and tell us what is happening there.
Yeah, I'd like to, because bad news seems to be more catchy than good news. But yes, we have started to advertise for small business suppliers so that we can start creating that register of small business suppliers. We can't assume that just because a business is a registered small business that they're interested in supplying a government or interested in government procurement or even have the capacity to bid for government contracts. So we have to create a register of small business suppliers, and we decided to start that registration process as of last weekend. The program itself, we plan to start it in January. You know, it is well overdue. The Small Business Act was first passed, I believe, in 2004, and a key provision in that act speaks of government using its best endeavors to ensure that small businesses receive 20% of government contracts. That has never been pursued by the previous administration, and we, on coming into office, did take a decision that this is something that we want to make happen. Of course, it's a lot more complicated than just saying, you know, let's start giving contracts to small businesses. One of the most tricky parts of it is how do you measure small business procurement across the entire set of procuring agencies. So that, I believe, we have finally figured out, and a number of other things need to be in place. And so right now, we believe we are ready to go ahead with a program that sets a threshold of $30 million below which all procurements will go to small businesses, provided that there is capacity within the small business sector to execute those programs.
And you've put $100 million altogether
no, that's separate.
Into the fund, into a small business fund that is separate.
That is very separate. There's something called the Small Business Development Fund that is, it's supposed to be used to provide access to finance for small businesses. And that is what that $100 million allocation is for grants and for loans to small businesses. But it is timely because it allows us to perhaps assist small businesses to access procurement. For instance, bid security. There are a number of areas where small businesses may wish to get into public procurement but might find themselves challenged financially. So that $100 million can assist in that regard to some extent. But it wasn't specifically designed for that. It was really meant to assist small businesses access to finance across the board.
Actually, I was just going to ask you if you can couple it, but you said yes in terms of the fund versus the small business loan. The fact that people did not pay as much attention to the advertisement, though, in terms, particularly the younger generation who may have small businesses, what else are you going to be doing to encourage people to realize, wait a minute, we can bid for these 20% in terms of procurement? What are the areas you're going to be looking at to make sure people understand that?
Well, we have to do some public awareness exercises. Advertising is just the first part of it. We have been talking about it for long enough. Hopefully it will get some prominence coming out of these budget debates, because it has already been attacked by the opposition, so that probably will get it into the media a little more, so I have to thank them for that. But we have to go out and, you know, let it be known that, yes, small businesses can bid for contracts. Of course, you have to be able to execute the contracts. You know, there's no shortcut to it. We're not saying that, you know, a contract requiring a certain level of competence, and we're going to overlook that qualifications and competence just to give contracts to small businesses. So a lot of capacity building has to take place also. The Small Business Bureau is prepared to do training and so that the small businesses can, first of all, get a better understanding of the whole procurement process and the bidding process, but also in terms of technical expertise and simple things like planning and budgeting and being able to execute contracts on time. All those things have to be, there is a dearth of capacity when it comes to, but not just in the small business sector, to be quite honest with you. There's some large contractors that cannot manage contracts properly. So I wouldn't limit it to the small business sector, but we would like this program to work. We would like this program to also achieve value for money, for taxpayers' dollars. So we want to make sure that the small businesses are properly prepared for government contracts starting from next year. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I have to be honest, I don't like selling false hope and creating false expectations. We are unlikely to reach the 20% target in the first year. But unlike the previous government, we have started. And that will give us the data we need to make the necessary adjustments to the program, whether it's raising the threshold, whether it's coming up with some other ways of ensuring that small businesses can get contracts. There are subcontracting options where the prime contractor can be encouraged to subcontract to small businesses a certain percentage of the procurement. I understand that that could be a little tricky legally due to the Procurement Act, but it is an option at least that we can start looking at and see if the Public Procurement Commission would be amenable to some amendment that would allow such a system to be introduced. So there are many options, but first of all, you have to have the data to know whether the program is achieving its intended goals, whether, year on year, more contracts are going to small businesses, and that will tell us, well, okay, we're heading in the right direction, then we can start setting some targets. Say by 2022, 2025, we will hit that 20% and then, go even further if desirable.
But some of that data you can get from the Bureau of Statistics and what have you. No. No. Procurements are not broken down. Companies that are awarded contracts, there's no way of identifying whether it's a small business or a large business. So that is the challenge immediately. So by registering businesses with the Small Business Bureau as suppliers and creating a unique identifier, it means that at the end of any quarter or month or whenever we want to report, we can, through the National Accounting System, be able to say, well, these are the small businesses that received contracts or that received payments, procurement payments, and we can quantify that and report that as a percentage of the total amount of procurement. Therefore, it's very important, Minister, for the small businesses to at least register.
It is extremely important for the small businesses to register with the Small Business Bureau, because it is the Small Business Bureau that has to verify that this business meets the criteria to be considered a small business. That has to be verified. And once you are an approved small business, registered with the Small Business Bureau, then you qualify for the various benefits that small businesses are entitled to, including the being a beneficiary of the Small Business Procurement Program.
Good. And since we're on the small business, let's dilate a little bit on the small business fund, which, as you said, is a different thing. Again, it's not something that people have been hearing about, and we have not been talking about it, as far as I'm concerned, enough. Give us an idea as to what persons who want to access this fund would have to do. to get this $100 million. And of course, they're not getting the whole 100 million, they get a part thereof, right?
They'll get a part thereof. The grants, I believe, will be limited to around $300,000 per grant. And first of all, you have to be a registered small business. You have to undergo some form of basic training because you'll have to put up a proposal. You have to do a business plan. In the past, under a previous program in which grants were disbursed, those grants were disbursed directly to the vendors. So if a small business came in and said, look, I need a grant to procure equipment for my small business, then that grant was disbursed directly to the vendor of that equipment. Because there are some safeguards that need to be put in place so that you're not seen to be just giving away money. It is a business development program aimed at growing small business, developing small businesses. It is not meant to be a handout, and that is very important to note. But in this particular construct with this 100 million Small Business Development Fund, we have noted some of the difficulties faced by small businesses in accessing a loan and grant funding under the previous system, which was a project overseen by the IDB and subject to a number of controls because it was made possible with money from the LCDS, from the GRIF, and that came with certain restrictions. This time around, we want to remove some of the restrictions, make it more accessible, but at the same time, ensure that the money is disbursed for business purposes and that businesses benefit from the grant in a developmental way, that they develop as a result of the grant. It's not money spending money. It is money to invest in your business. Ideally, what we would like to see happen with that money, because there's a loan guarantee program that we're also rolling out with that money. And we guarantee, the Small Business Bureau will guarantee up to, let's say, 70% of the loan collateral required. So if you can take the $300,000 and let's say make up the additional 30%, it means that you can either more easily access a loan or maybe get a bigger loan. So we would like to see that money used as additional security for a bigger loan. That would be one, another good way of utilizing that money. But there are a number of ways. I mean, a business comes for a grant, they want a grant, they have to tell us what they want to do with the grant. We're not forcing them into any area that they're not comfortable with. But the bottom line is it has to be used for some viable, sustainable business activity.
Minister, you are the Minister of Business. I'm speaking to the Minister of Business on Budget in Focus on NCN. And when your government, your coalition grouping was campaigning to get into government, you promised people jobs. And you go around, people say, look, you made a promise. And as the Minister of Business, one would expect you to be able to say, well, we've been able to achieve this by doing this. What have you been able to achieve?
That's a very unfortunate question, Enrico. And I say this because we have never really reported regularly on unemployment or job creation. In the United States, every month they can tell you how many new jobs were created, what the rate of unemployment is. We have not either developed a methodology for measuring unemployment and reporting on it regularly. And when I say we, I'm speaking of successive governments, and I'm speaking especially of the government that was in power for 23 years, during which the technology was evolving and the world was becoming much more informed. And I think the Guyanese people had every right to expect that during that period, that some methodology would have evolved that would have allowed the government to report quarterly, or quarterly is better, on the rates of unemployment in Guyana, not because we want to lambaste the government and scream about unemployment, but because unless you know what the unemployment figures are, you don't know if your interventions to stimulate the economy are having an effect on unemployment. We have not been able to fully correct that. I know earlier this year, the Ministry of Finance did put out some figures coming out of a survey that was done on unemployment. I don't know if it is meant to be an annual report. It would be good because these figures need to be reported on with regularity so that you know the direction in which you're going. You know if it's going up or if it's going down. So unfortunately, I cannot answer your question, but what I can tell you, as I said earlier, a lot of the programs within the Ministry of Business are ultimately designed to stimulate private sector growth and development for the purpose of job creation. Because government is not going to create all the jobs that people need. Private sector has to create jobs and employment, and that is why we need to ensure that the private sector has that space to grow and develop and create those jobs.
And within the budget estimates printed by the Ministry of Finance, you have indicators, and some of those indicators say, well, you were to do X, and you know, you would have achieved Y and so on. And particularly Go Invest, which comes under your ministry, has been involved in doing some of that. What do we expect Go Invest to do for next year based on the estimates that they would have received?
Go Invest is primarily responsible for investment promotion, investment facilitation, and export promotion. And that does not change year to year. That's what they do. Next year, I know that they intend to do things such as trade show representation, inward, outward bound missions to explore investment and market opportunities, exporter training to share with exporters important information on things like costing and pricing and trade show participation and business-to-business negotiations and strategies and stuff like that. Because there are a lot of trade shows internationally. Go Invest would attend a few every year and try to encourage some local private sector businesses to take part, especially those in the export sector, value-added sector. And it is important that when they take part in these expos that they are properly prepared. Because exporting is new to a lot of Guyanese businesses. We have, for a very long time, survived on exporting bulk items, usually through some government agency. So individual private sector persons exporting is a bit of a novelty, and we need to sort of learn how international markets work, how you access those markets, the distribution systems that exist in various countries for various types of products. And that is something that you know, you need some expertise. And for instance, at the recent Gaitai event that we had in September, there were a few seminars, and we did have some speakers from Canada, the USA, and from Latin America explaining to local businesses how you access the markets in those countries. Because every country has its own peculiarities, its own requirements for different types of goods and services. So it's important for businesses to understand that. So Go Invest does a lot of that kind of work with exporters, but also with investors, whether foreign investors or local investors, but a lot of foreign investors do end up on the doorsteps of Go Invest. And, you know, they want to know the ins and outs of investing in Guyana. Some come with specific proposals and need to understand where they need to go with those proposals, how these proposals can be become reality. And Go Invest has to ultimately, at the end of the day, depending on the nature of the investment, what Go Invest does is to facilitate the signing of an investment agreement between the investor and the government of Guyana, which gives them the fiscal concessions that they are applying for. These are governed by law, so for investments in various different sectors, there are different entitlements, such as duty-free importation of equipment, for instance. These are all, as I said, governed by law and accessed through an investment agreement, which Go Invest assists to process.
Which brings me to the ease of doing business in Guyana, because one of the complaints you hear, and you hear a lot of complaints once you live in a country like Guyana, that it's not easy for businesses to open, and they need this license and that license and the other, as my mother used to say, the taro. But where does the single window automated processing system fall into this? It seems to be a huge project, 1.2 billion by the IDB, but only 100 million has been allocated for this year.
Correct. The single electronic window is a trade facilitation initiative. And in terms of the ease of doing business, there are a number of indicators that make up the annual doing business report, trading across borders being one of them. So this would fall into that particular indicator as a trade facilitation initiative, making it a lot easier to do import-export business. The single window is really an online portal which is accessed by the importer or the exporter, and the transaction is supposed to be done with a single submission by that importer or exporter, and that submission is then routed to the various agencies, in particular the GRA, which is a key stakeholder in that process. But sometimes other agencies have to give permissions or endorsements, etc., depending on what product is being exported or imported. So that is done electronically, which removes the scope for interference, makes it faster. A lot of the different agencies, the processes can be simultaneously automated, as opposed to the individual having to run sequentially from one office to another, back and forth. So it will drastically reduce the amount of time taken for these very basic transactions. Why the relatively small spend next year, to answer your original question though, is that there's a lot of technical work that has to be done up front. The things like business process re-engineering, where each process has to be mapped out and I guess re-engineered. I'm not a technical person, but so that it can then be automated or computerized, digitized. There are some regulatory issues that have to be also cleared up. So the idea would be to get a lot of the technical issues ironed out next year, so that the actual system can be built up and installed over the next few years, come 2020, 2021. It is supposed to be up and running fully by 2022. It involves a number of agencies, not just the GRA, but about 10 or 12 government agencies. So it's quite large in scope. And that's where I think that's why it's so expensive, because each of those agencies has to be integrated into the system. Each of those agencies will have to have their processes digitized, will have to have the necessary software and hardware to be able to automate their processes. So I think that is where the big spend will come in after the technical work has been done.
And speaking of big spend, I also noticed that you have about $350 million in your capital expenditure. And among other things, for one particular project, it has a national export and investment promotion policy. Is that part of what you were talking about early on with Go Invest, or this is a different thing?
That is a component of the project, and that component concerns Go Invest. But the project itself, we call it the National Quality Infrastructure Project, and it's a project that is designed to diversify our exports through an enhanced national quality infrastructure. What is meant by national quality infrastructure is not my terminology. I came and met it, so to speak. But that's the network of laboratories that exist in Guyana that can do testing and certification of products. That is what is being enhanced through this project, so that as an exporter, you have access to testing facilities that can certify your products, and these would be accredited testing facilities that can give you certification for your products that is internationally accepted by whichever country you want to export to. So that is very important, because prior to now, a lot of testing had to be done overseas. A lot of samples have to be sent overseas. So this will ensure that as much as possible we can do testing locally, and that testing will be done by accredited laboratories and testing facilities. So that is what is being done. The bulk of the money will go towards the construction of a new laboratory for the Guyana National Bureau of Standards. But there are some other components of that project involving the modernization of the National Bureau of Standards, institutional strengthening, also of the other existing network of laboratories, both public and private, just ensuring that more of those laboratories are accredited. And the final component is a national export strategy and national investment strategy, so that you have the means of testing exports. You also now want the strategy to go with it, the export strategy to complement that, and the investment strategy to encourage investments in those areas that you have now streamlined for exports. So it's a very integrated project, and it's a multi-year project.
And this is under the Bureau of Standards, which...
Yeah, they are the main beneficiary agency of that loan. It's a loan through the IDB. The total loan amount is $9 million US, and the project started this year, disbursement started this year, and will continue next year until 2022.
Which brings me as a beautiful segue to the Competition and Consumer Affairs Division that also comes under your ministry. I'm speaking with the Minister of Business, Dominic Gaskin, on the estimates for his ministry. And the Consumer Affairs Bureau or department or whatever it's called deals with consumer rights, deals with complaints, deals with dangerous products and so on. Guyana has suffered from, as my friend would say, a lot of cabo products, kinds of things and so on. What is the Consumer Affairs division or unit doing in particular to ensure that we have products that are of good quality?
A lot of it has to do with public awareness. The Competition Consumer Affairs Commission receives complaints. In the first instance, they try to resolve those complaints without it going to the commission. Usually about more than half of the complaints are actually resolved in that way. Some of them resulting in settlements by the business, or sometimes it's actually the consumer that is at fault. And a few of those complaints actually have to be addressed at the level of the commission itself. A not so known function of the Competition and Consumer Affairs Commission, though, is in the area of competition. You know, in America, I think they use the term antitrust laws. But anything that skews competition, where you have, for instance, large businesses abusing their dominance in the market to skew the competition, or where you have, for instance, a number of businesses coming together to do price fixing or colluding on fixing prices, that again is anti-competitive behavior. And that there are some very heavy laws that address those kinds of matters. And that is what they do at a very, it's very high-level work. We do not have that many matters because of the size of our economy, and we don't have, you know, these huge multinationals operating in Guyana. But at the same time, there are a few areas where they have had to conduct investigations and refer matters to the Commission, because it's very important for the well-being of the consumer that there exists fair competition, and that competition is not skewed by any sort of anti-competitive behavior. There is a very recent development where I had cause to ask the director of the Competition and Consumer Affairs Commission whether or not our laws had provisions that dealt with mergers and acquisitions. Because again, mergers and acquisitions can result in two large companies either one acquiring the other or merging into a behemoth that again can skew competition, that can, you know, dominate the market and to the detriment of the consumer. So it plays a very important role, but again, it's a behind-the-scenes type of work. It's not something a lot of people are familiar with. But in terms of what they do or what can they do to influence the behavior of businesses towards consumer, a lot of it is public awareness, inspections. There is the Consumer Affairs Act, which does set out quite clearly the responsibilities of businesses to do certain things, to have certain exchange policies in place, etc., which, as we know, many Guyanese businesses do not. Mm-hmm. So they do a lot of inspections, more and more. They have a small staff, limited resources, so they do what they can do. But I know this year they received about 200 and something reports. Close to half of those were resolved. A number of those are still ongoing, and a few, as I said earlier, were referred to the Board of Commissioners of the Competition and Consumer Affairs Commission.
And what happens there? Because a lot of times you hear, well, it's either the large businesses who have control over these things, or it's a small man hustle, you know, so don't give him so much of a hard time because he's just trying something. So what happens, let us know what happens that the public can be assured, well, look, the ministry is doing something here.
No, any consumer who purchases a product, for instance, or a service and is not satisfied with that service or product can make a complaint to the Competition and Consumer Affairs Commission. That complaint will be dealt with. As I said, in the first instance, there's an attempt to resolve the matter to the satisfaction of both parties, usually seeking a refund or something like along those lines. That tends to work. Sometimes it's a little more complicated. The consumer may have used the item for a few days or a few weeks before the defect is materializes, and then it's a little more complicated because the obvious response from the business is, well, that they have somehow contributed to the whatever the fault is, or misused the appliance or the equipment, in which case there's an investigation done. But if there is no resolution, you know, from the two parties, if neither party is willing to accept a resolution without, you know, escalating the matter, then it goes to the Board of Commissioners, and that commission has legal powers, almost like a court of law. They can adjudicate in the matter and pronounce on it and pass a judgment on it.
Minister Gaskin, we are coming up to the last 15 minutes of the program, so to speak. And I wanted to go into an area that you went into earlier this morning when you spoke with regard to tourism. We may be able to get from tourist arrivals and so on next year. That figure is right?
So I get figures in US dollars because when it comes to big numbers, I like to use US dollars because I myself get confused. But I think what I did say this morning in my presentation to the National Assembly is that tourism is underestimated as an export industry. It is an export industry. It brings in foreign earnings. And we have been using a very conservative estimate of $500 US spent locally per visitor, per overseas visitor. The international statistics tend to show a spend of closer to like $1,100 US. But we are very conservative because we don't have the data to support it. So we are using conservative figures. So if you look at visitor arrivals of this year, it is likely, the visitor arrivals are likely to be in excess of, let's say, around 260,000 visitor arrivals.
As this year, 2018?
2018. I can't give you an exact figure. The year hasn't concluded yet, and I only have data up to September or October. But if you say 260, so that's a considerable amount of money. And sometimes we don't always get that, you know, after gold and rice, tourism is our third largest export. It is more than sugar and bauxite, I believe, and most of the other export industries. Now, it's not a race to see which is more. I'm just simply saying that sometimes because it's less tangible, we tend to overlook it. But it's a very important industry, and one of the beauties about tourism is that money spent by visitors in Guyana tends to be spent in a variety of areas that it's very cross-cutting, and a lot of people can benefit from it and do benefit from it. And of course, we are trying to promote our attractive hinterland, our unspoiled, green, lush, beautiful rainforest and all the natural attractions, our savannas and so. And because there are so many communities in those areas that we feel can benefit from tourism. You know, we want to promote community-based tourism, where the communities themselves are the main beneficiaries of the visitors that visit those communities, the visitor flows to those communities. That is the model that we want to promote. We are not looking to create you know, huge hotels in the interior, but we like to see what I like to call a network of eco-lodges throughout our interior, linked to communities, existing communities, and in as far as possible, owned by those communities so that they become the stakeholders, you know, in the tourism that takes place in their communities. Because right now we have a situation where Kaichur Falls, it's our big natural attraction. We're all proud of it. We know how beautiful it is. But there's no community close by that is benefiting from all the traffic that goes in and out to Kaichur Falls. You know, we'd like to see the area developed for tourism in a way that benefits the communities in Region 8, the ones that are close to Kaichur Falls. I know there are no communities in the immediate vicinity, but there are communities that can benefit from tourism, from the tourism that Kaichur can bring to that region.
So the Guyana Tourism Authority and the tourism, there are two areas that...
there's a Department of Tourism, which is policy and strategic direction, and then there's the Guyana Tourism Authority, which is the executing agency. They're responsible for tourism development, marketing and promoting, and also for regulating and licensing within the sector.
And that last one, the tourism development and promotion, it's almost $400 million,
$301 million has been allocated to the GTA, the Guyana Tourism Authority, and I think $93 million or thereabouts to the department. The GTA has a bigger staff, and as I said, they are more responsible for executing the policies and strategic direction of the Department of Tourism.
And you're satisfied so far, Minister, that our tourism product is being promoted in a way that you're so pleased about? Yeah.
I'm never satisfied. As a matter of fact, I would say that I would like to see more emphasis placed on product development as opposed to promotion, because we do marketing. We don't over-market, but it is important that we develop what we have so that when we're marketing Guyana, Destination Guyana, we are marketing a product that actually exists. There are a lot of deficiencies that still exist in the product on the ground. You know, we can't keep slapping ourselves on the back and pretending that we are a fully developed tourism destination. We are not. There is work to be done, and that work is being done, I'm happy to say, but it is not yet complete. There is a lot more to be done before I personally would be comfortable in saying that I believe we are ready to fully market, you know, Guyana's tourism product. We are not there as yet.
The other aspect of marketing our tourism product is to whom are we marketing this product? And various people in the country have various views as to who we ought to attract to come to Guyana and which markets we ought to be looking at. For example, some people are saying that we should look at the Chinese-Japanese market as against the European market to make sure people come to Guyana. Is there a focus or is there a general position?
There's a sort of a broad strategy where we already know where our core markets are, and we will continue to market in our core markets. There are markets that are considered strategic markets where we know that, you know, with the right approach, those markets can also be accessed and are, you know, and there's sufficient interest in our type of product. And then there are those markets that are known as investment markets where we are willing to invest in promoting Guyana within those markets. Those are not our core or even our strategic markets. So there are different market segments, and we wouldn't want to exclude any particular market, but we have to accept that Guyana is not easily accessible. So strategically, you want to market Guyana first and foremost to destinations that have access to Guyana, or in destinations that have access to Guyana. It doesn't mean that we would ignore the other countries, because with more accessibility, and we do anticipate developments in the aviation sector that will bring new airlines to Guyana from different parts of the world. Not on a huge scale, but we certainly have seen some interest, and I'm aware of some discussions. Depending on how those develop, then we have additional markets that are more easily accessible for us. That would then dictate how, here's a new area that we can promote Guyana in. So it's quite complicated when you are now starting off, and when you have, just one or two scheduled airlines operating in and out of Guyana. Well, more like 4 or 5. But, it's not a lot. And everyone who comes to Guyana will tell you how difficult it was to get here. Up to last week, I met some potential investors who complained about it taking them 48 hours to get here. That's not a good thing. It takes too long to get to Guyana, especially if you're coming from somewhere, let's say in Asia or so. So that is one of the drawbacks, and that prevents us from, spending funds marketing Guyana in those areas, because you're not going to get a lot of traction in a market that cannot access your country. So we still have to concentrate on our core markets, but at the same time, without ignoring some of the other strategic areas that where we feel that there is interest, that the demand exists, and that the accessibility might not be perfect, but is not as bad as some of the other areas.
Minister, I've heard a criticism too that we bring in somebody from outside to market our country, paying him nearly $2 million and so on and so on. The idea of tourism promotion means you've got to invest, don't you? And is that the reason why you sought to invest in someone who would promote the country in a way that probably persons from within Guyana may not realize that there are ways that you can promote it?
We didn't set out to bring somebody from outside. We set out to bring the necessary expertise to the GTA. It so happened that when the position was advertised, and the board started receiving applications, a lot of those applications came from outside of Guyana, and a lot of very high-level applicants had applied. And the bottom line is that if you want to access international markets, and this is regardless of what you're producing, you have to involve international expertise. Tourism is a well-organized industry. It's not a bottom-house industry. It's well-organized internationally. And people in the industry understand how it works. And if it is necessary to bring someone from outside of Guyana to run tourism in Guyana, who understands the industry, who understands what the market requires, who has the networking capacity to, go beyond Guyana and bring in additional expertise, attract funding, then that has to be done. I mean, we can, we're all proud Guyanese. We're not happy when we don't have the skills locally, but sometimes you don't. And you have to admit it, and you have to bring in the skills you need to get the job done. You also have to ensure that when you bring skills in from outside, that there's a lot of transfer of knowledge, transfer of skills, so that you don't have to do it forever. And that is part of the process, that you have to ensure that the people around are able to understand what is happening, are able to learn, that there's mentorship, so that at the end of the contract term, Guyana is in a position to do more for itself.
Wonderful. Minister, before we go, one last question on the industrial
Yes.
areas that you are going to be developing the industrial estates, particularly Latham and Belvedere. Give us an idea what you're going to be doing.
Both of them will be completed and ready for occupancy by the middle of next year. Latham is by far the larger of the two. It's a significant investment. It has cost, or it will cost once completed, in the vicinity of $1.5 billion. It is 28 hectares in size. There are 68 plots available for industrial tenants. There is a business incubator that is currently being constructed on the site that is going to create some opportunities for smaller businesses, for startups, to also be part of that whole Latham estate experience. And we're looking to attract, in the first instance, 4 large, what we call anchor tenants, in different types of industries, because we have 4 larger plots, and then the rest are standard size. They're different sizes, but there are 4 that are especially large, and we're hoping to bring in a few large tenants. It is not going to be easy, like I said, but we should have our prospectus ready by the end of this year or very early next year. We want to send that out. We want to start receiving applications by January. Those applications are going to be processed, and we should be in a position to start issuing leases before the middle of next year.
Minister of Business, Dominic Gaskin, thank you very much for talking with us this evening on Budget in Focus. I'm Enrico Wilford. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye for now.